The dust of redemption settled in layers of fine red powder coating everything from the sweat-stained brim of a man's hat to the soul of Jedediah Jed Stone. He stood inside the mercantile, the scent of canvas coffee beans and dry rot filling his nostrils, a smell he associated with the necessary evils of civilization. His list was short salt flour cartridges, a month's worth of solitude bought and paid for in a single grudging trip to town. Outside, the sun was a merciless hammer against the anvil of the sky, beating the life out of the dusty main street. Jed was counting out coins onto the worn countertop when the world shattered. It wasn't the single gunshot that did it. It was the symphony of chaos that followed. The sharp crack of a Colt, the panicked shriek from the street, the sudden violent splintering of the mercantile's front window. Glass exploded inward, raining down like frozen tears. Jed reacted without thinking, his body a coiled spring of forgotten instincts. He dropped low, pulling the balding shopkeeper Mr. Abernathy down with him behind the counter. "Get down," Jed's voice was a low growl, rough from disuse. Through the shattered window he saw them. 4 riders, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas. They moved with a predatory grace, dismounting and storming the bank across the street. A 5th man remained on his horse in the center of the street, a magnificent black stallion that shifted nervously under him. This man wore no mask. His face was lean and angular, framed by dark hair that curled from beneath a fine black hat. He sat with an unnerving stillness, a king surveying his domain of terror. Even from a distance, Jed could see the faint, cruel smile playing on his lips. The gunshots from the bank were muffled, punctuated by screams. Jed's hand, calloused and hard from ranch work, twitched. The ghost of a peacemaker's grip settled into his palm, a phantom limb he'd severed years ago. He was a rancher now, a recluse. He raised cattle and ghosts, nothing more. This wasn't his fight. A stray bullet from the chaos outside ripped through the mercantile wall, whining past Jed's ear and striking a tall glass display case near the back of the store. The case filled with what Abernathy called fine ladies' notions, brooches, hairpins, and cheap jewelry, imploded. A cascade of glittering trinkets scattered across the dusty floorboards. Jed's breath caught in his throat. His world, which had shattered only moments before, now ground to a dead, silent halt. There, glinting amidst the shards of glass and imitation pearls, lay a silver locket. It was oval-shaped, intricately engraved with a pair of climbing roses whose thorns intertwined with the stems. It couldn't be. The locket was a perfect twin to the one he had given his wife Eleanor on their first anniversary. The one she never took off. The one that should have been buried with her, melted into unrecognizable silver in the ashes of their first home. The fire had taken everything the sheriff had said. Nothing left but ash and memory. The bank doors burst open. The 4 masked men scrambled out, heavy satchels slung over their shoulders. They mounted their horses, firing wildly into the air to scatter the few brave or foolish townsfolk who had dared to watch. Their leader, the man on the black stallion, remained impassive. His gaze swept the street, a look of bored mastery on his face. He was about to give the signal to ride when his eyes fell on the shattered window of the mercantile. He saw the glittering mess on the floor. With a fluid motion, he dismounted his silver-spurred boots, sinking into the thick dust. He walked not to the bank, but to the mercantile, his long duster coat swirling around him. He didn't bother with the door, instead, stepping gracefully through the broken frame of the window. Jed remained frozen behind the counter, a conflict raging within him, fiercer than the gun battle outside. His body screamed to stay hidden, to cling to the quiet, empty life he had built. But his heart, a dead thing for 5 long years, gave a painful, violent lurch. The man Silas Kane, as Jed would later learn, he called himself, ignored the trembling Abernathy. His eyes cold and gray as a winter sky scanned the floor. He crouched, his movements elegant and precise, and picked through the debris. His fingers bypassed a gaudy pearl necklace, a cheap brass ring, and settled on the silver locket. He held it up, letting it dangle from its delicate chain. It caught the light, the engraved roses seeming to bloom in the dusty sunbeam slanting through the broken window. He smiled a private, knowing smile, as if he'd found exactly what he was looking for. He didn't open it. He simply let it swing once, twice, then casually slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. He turned and stepped back out into the street, mounting his horse as his men wheeled around him. For a moment, his gaze locked with Jed's through the jagged hole in the wall. The smile on his face widened, a chilling, intimate gesture that felt like a violation. It was a look that said, "I see you, and I know what this means to you." Then he spurred his horse, and the gang thundered out of Redemption, leaving behind a cloud of red dust and the smell of gunpowder, and a silence filled with a deafening roar in Jedediah Stone's head. The fight, he now knew, had been his all along. The ranch was Jed's sanctuary and his prison. 100 acres of unforgiving land, carved out of the rocky, sun-scorched earth, bordered on 3 sides by sheer-faced mesas that bled crimson in the evening light. His cabin was small and brutally simple, built by his own hands with an almost obsessive precision. The floorboards were scrubbed clean, and the tools in the shed were hung in meticulous order, and the single wool blanket on his narrow bed was always pulled taut and the corner folded at a perfect 90-degree angle. It was a life of rigid control, a desperate attempt to impose order on a world that had proven to be nothing but chaos. The red dust of the plains seemed to glow under the sun, a constant reminder of the fire. 5 years. 5 years since he'd woken in a field thrown clear of the explosion. The night sky turned a hellish orange behind him. He remembered the heat, the roar like a hungry beast, and a scream his own. Eleanor. The name was a scar on his soul, a word he hadn't spoken aloud since that night. The official report called it a tragic accident. A lantern overturned, dry timber, a wind that fanned the flames faster than any man could run. Jed had accepted the verdict because the alternative, the gnawing certainty of his own failure to protect her, was a truth too heavy to carry. So he carried guilt instead. It was a familiar weight. Back in the sterile quiet of his cabin, the image of the locket burned behind his eyes. He moved through the motions of his life, stoking the fire, checking the water barrel, feeding the 2 horses he kept. But his hands felt like they belonged to a stranger. His gaze kept drifting to a large, dust-covered wooden chest pushed against the far wall. It was locked, the key hidden in a loose floorboard beneath his bed, a place he hadn't touched in half a decade. He could feel the ghosts stirring. They were always there, silent companions in the vast emptiness. But now they had voices. Memories ambushed him in sharp, brutal flashes. The crackle of the fire. Short, stabbing sentences of pain. The smell of burning pine and something else. He saw Eleanor's smile, her auburn hair catching the lamplight as she read by the fire. Her laughter light as cottonwood fluff on the breeze. He felt the agonizing pressure in his chest, the phantom weight of her head on his shoulder, as they watched the sunset paint the mesas. These were not gentle remembrances. They were attacks, each one a twist of the knife in a wound that would not heal. He worked until his muscles screamed, trying to sweat the memories out, to exhaust the rage and confusion into submission. He mended a fence line under the punishing sun, his movements mechanical, his mind a battlefield. The vast, lonely landscape that usually offered a stark comfort now felt like a cage. The silence of the plains, once a balm, now amplified the screaming in his head. The long, sweeping vista of the horizon, stretching out to an eternity of red and blue, offered no escape. It only showed him how far he had run and how utterly he had failed to get away. Night fell, bringing a deceptive coolness. The moon rose a pale, indifferent eye in the black velvet sky. Jed sat at his small, handmade table, a plate of cold beans untouched before him. He stared at his hands. They were rancher's hands now, thick with calluses, the skin cracked and stained by dirt. But underneath, the memory of a different life remained. The muscle memory of drawing a pistol, the precise feel of a rifle stock against his cheek, the cold, hard weight of a U.S. Marshal's badge. He couldn't escape it. The man in the black hat, Silas Kane, hadn't just stolen a piece of silver. He had stolen Jed's peace. He had reached back through 5 years of carefully constructed solitude and dragged Jed's past into the light. The casual way he'd picked up the locket, the knowing smile, it was a challenge. A message. It was personal. Finally, Jed stood. His movements were slow, deliberate, and the movements of a man surrendering to the inevitable. He walked to his cot, knelt, and pried up the loose floorboard. His fingers brushed against the cold, familiar shape of the iron key. He pulled it out, the metal cool against his skin, a stark contrast to the fire in his gut. He unlocked the chest. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound of a tomb being opened. The air that rose from within was stale, thick, with the scent of gun oil, old leather, and regret. There, nestled in oilcloth, lay the tools of his former life. A Colt Peacemaker, its blued steel gleaming even in the dim lamplight. A Winchester rifle, its stock worn smooth from his hand. And beneath them, a twin-looped holster and a gun belt, the leather still supple. Resting in the center was his badge. A 5-pointed star, tarnished with time, but still radiating a silent authority. U.S. Marshal, Jedediah Stone. He lifted the gun belt. The weight of it was immense, far heavier than the leather and steel it was made of. As his fingers closed around the cold metal of the badge, a memory clear and pure broke through the fog of his pain. It was a summer evening, and the air sweet with the scent of night-blooming jasmine Eleanor had planted by the porch. She stood before him, the silver locket in her palm. It was new then, shining brightly. For you, she'd said, her green eyes full of a light that could outshine any star. So you'll always have my heart with you, Jedediah, to bring you home safe. He remembered the feel of her fingers as she fastened it around her neck, her touch gentle against his rough hands. It's beautiful, Ellie. He'd whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. Not as beautiful as the thought of you coming back to me, she'd replied, her smile a promise of everything good in the world. The memory faded, leaving Jed in the silent cabin, the cold weight of the badge in one hand, the phantom touch of his wife's love in the other. He looked from the tools of the lawman to the empty space on the wall, where a picture of his wife used to hang, a space he could no longer bear to look at. The choice was no longer a choice. It was a reckoning. Silas Kane had started this. Jedediah Stone, the man he thought he'd buried, would finish it. He strapped on the gun belt. It settled on his hips with a grim familiarity, an old skin he had shed, but never truly outgrown. The rancher was gone. The marshal was back. The first light of dawn found Jed riding not west toward his grazing lands, but east, back toward redemption. He moved with a purpose that had been absent from his life for 5 years. He rode straight to the small sheriff's office, a clapboard box that seemed to wilt in the morning heat. Sheriff Miller, a young man, barely old enough to grow the sandy mustache that adorned his upper lip, looked up from his paperwork surprised. He was a good man, earnest and hard-working, who had always afforded the reclusive Mr. Stone a wide berth out of respect for his unspoken grief. "Mr. Stone," Miller said, standing. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon. Something I can help you with." Jed's presence filled the small office. He wasn't a large man, but he carried an intensity that seemed to suck the air out of the room. He had the gun belt on. Miller's eyes flickered down to the Colt tied low on Jed's thigh, and then back up, his expression shifting from curiosity to caution. "The robbery yesterday," Jed said, his voice flat. "The man leading them. Silas Kane." "Yes, sir. That's the name we're hearing. Rode with a nasty crew. We sent a wire to the Marshal's service in Prescott, but I don't expect to hear back for days. They're stretched thin." Miller hesitated. "Heard you were in the mercantile when it happened. You see something that might help?" He took something Jed said, ignoring the question. "From the display case, a silver locket." Miller frowned. "A locket? With all that money from the bank, he stopped for a piece of cheap jewelry." "It wasn't cheap to me." The words were clipped, sharp-edged. He offered no further explanation. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough. "I'm going after him," Jed stated. It was not a request for permission. Sheriff Miller ran a hand through his hair. He knew the stories about Jedediah Stone, the whispers of the man he used to be before the fire, before he'd walled himself up on that ranch. He saw the truth of those stories now standing before him like a specter. "Mr. Stone." "Jed." "This is official business. Kane and his men are wanted federal. You go after them, you're just a citizen, a vigilante." Jed reached into his saddlebag, which he'd carried in with him, and placed the tarnished star on Miller's desk. The younger man stared at it, his mouth slightly agape. "I was a U.S. Marshal for 10 years, Jed said softly. "It's still official. It's just personal business now." Understanding and a fair amount of awe dawned on Miller's face. He nodded slowly. They rode south. A rancher about 10 miles out saw them heading toward the Black Creek Pass. They were moving fast. He gestured to a map on the wall. "If they're smart, they'll hole up in one of the mining camps in the next county. Easy place to get lost. Hard place to find someone who doesn't want to be found." "I'll find him," Jed said. It was a promise. He turned to leave, but Miller's voice stopped him. "Marshal, be careful. A man like Kane. He isn't just a thief." The way he sat there watching, he was enjoying it. There's a special kind of poison in a man like that. Jed paused at the door, his back to the sheriff. "I know the kind." His pursuit began. He cut south, the trail easy to follow at first. 5 riders moving hard leave a clear scar on the land. But as he entered the rocky terrain of the next county, the tracks became harder to read. This was Silas Kane's territory, not his. His first obstacle came in the form of a town called Dust Devil Springs, a miserable collection of tents and shacks that had sprung up around a silver claim. The law here was a man named Deputy Carnes, a portly, sweat-stained individual with shifty eyes and a badge that looked 2 sizes too small for his chest. Jed found him in the town's only saloon, nursing a glass of whiskey. "Looking for a man," Jed said, standing over his table. "Calls himself Silas Kane. Rode in yesterday with 4 others." Carnes squinted up at him, his gaze lingering on Jed's gun. "A lot of men ride through here. Can't keep track of them all. What's your business with him?" "He's wanted for bank robbery and murder in redemption," Jed said, keeping his voice even. Carnes laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Bank robbery. Hell, half the men in this room are wanted for something. Unless you've got a federal warrant with my name on it, I suggest you finish your drink and move on, stranger." He was lying. Jed could see it in the twitch of his eye, the way his hand rested a little too close to his own pistol. He was on Kane's payroll. Jed didn't argue. He didn't show his badge. That would only complicate things. Instead, he used the skills he'd honed over years of dealing with men like Carnes. He walked to the bar, ordered a water, and waited. He watched Carnes from the corner of his eye, observing, learning. An hour later, Carnes left the saloon and made his way to a small assay office at the edge of the camp. Jed followed. He didn't confront Carnes. He waited until the deputy left, and then he slipped the lock on the back door of the office. Inside, he found what he was looking for, a telegram hastily crumpled in a wastebasket. It was from Kane. "Payment for your silence is with the usual man. Keep nosy strangers out of my business. Skek." The telegram was from a town further south called Sulphur Gulch. Jed now had a destination. He had outsmarted the corrupt lawman not with a gun, but with patience and observation, the true tools of a marshal. He rode on the landscape growing harsher, more desolate. He stopped for information at a remote trading post, where an old prospector sat on the porch whittling a piece of wood. "5 riders," the old man rasped, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Yeah, I seen 'em. Passed through yesterday. The one in the lead, fancy fella on a black horse. He was humming." Jed's attention sharpened. Humming what? Don't know the name of it. An old tune, sort of sad. Haven't heard it in years. The prospector hummed a few bars, a haunting, melancholic melody that plucked a dissonant chord deep in Jed's memory. It was familiar. Terribly familiar. He pushed the thought away. A coincidence. Nothing more. His next stop was Sulphur Gulch, a larger, rowdier town teeming with miners and gamblers. In a saloon called the Gilded Cage, he found his next clue. A young saloon girl with weary eyes and a faded dress was wiping down tables. Jed bought her a drink and asked about Kane. Her face hardened. He was here. Threw money around like it was dirt. Charmed everyone, especially the ladies. She touched a faint bruise on her cheek, hidden beneath a layer of powder. "Until you said no." Then the charm disappeared. "Did you notice anything about him?" Jed asked, his voice gentle. A way he talked a habit. She thought for a moment. He had a strange way of holding his cigarette, tucked between his middle and ring finger. Never seen anyone else do that. She shivered. And he said something. When he got angry. He called me darling girl. But it wasn't sweet. It was cold, like a snake hissing. A darling girl. The words hit Jed like a physical blow. The saloon faded away. He was back in a dusty El Paso cantina years ago, sharing a bottle of tequila with his partner. His partner, Cole Garrett. A man as wild and charming as Jed, was quiet and serious. Cole, who always held his cigarette in that peculiar way. Cole, who had a habit of calling saloon girls darlin' girl with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Cole, who used to hum that same sad, haunting tune when he thought no one was listening. Cole Garrett, who had died in a shootout in Laredo, taking 3 bullets to the chest while Jed was pinned down, unable to help. Jed had seen him fall. He had identified the body himself. It was impossible. A ghost. A series of cruel coincidences designed by the devil himself to torment him. Jed pushed himself away from the table, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He had to be wrong. He had to be. But the seeds of a terrible, unthinkable suspicion had been planted, and they were beginning to take root. The trail led him high into the Dragoon Mountains, a maze of canyons and dry riverbeds, where a man could disappear for 100 years. The clues had stacked up a pile of coincidences so heavy, they threatened to crush him. The tune, the cigarette, the phrase. Each one was a whisper from the grave, a ghost story he refused to believe. He found one of Kane's men at a watering hole nursing a lame horse. The man was young, with frightened eyes that didn't fit his swagger. Jed didn't draw his gun. He dismounted, his movements slow and non-threatening, and approached as if he were just another traveler. "Horse through a shoe," Jed observed, gesturing with his chin. The kid nodded, wary. "Happens." Jed offered him his canteen. "Looks like you could use it." The young outlaw accepted the water, drinking greedily. He was either desperate or foolish. Maybe both. They shared a few minutes of silence, the only sounds the buzzing of flies and the tired horse's heavy breathing. "You ride with Kane," Jed stated simply. The kid's hand darted toward his pistol. Jed didn't move. He just watched him, his gaze level and cold. "I'm not here to kill you. I need to know about your boss." "I ain't telling you nothing." The kid stammered, his bravado crumbling. "He left you behind," Jed said, his voice quiet, reasonable. "A man with a lame horse in these mountains is a dead man. Is that the kind of loyalty you signed up for?" The kid's face fell. The truth of Jed's words hit him hard. "He's not a man you crossed," the kid whispered. "I know," Jed said. "But he's not who he says he is he?" He decided to take the shot, to voice the insane suspicion that had been festering in his mind. "Silas Kane is just a name he took. I want his real one." The kid shook his head, terrified. "He'd kill me." "I'll find him with or without your help." Jed pressed, his voice hardening. "If you help me, I'll let you take your horse and ride north. I won't come after you. You have my word." He leaned in closer, his shadow falling over the young man. "But if you lie to me, he won't have to kill you." The threat hung in the hot, still air. The kid swallowed hard, his eyes darting around as if Kane himself might materialize from the rocks. Finally, he broke. "He ain't Silas Kane." He confessed, the words rushing out in a torrent of fear. That's just what he started calling himself after. After Laredo. Said he was reborn. We all knew him by his real name. Jed's heart felt like a block of ice in his chest. He held his breath, waiting for the final damning word. "His name is Cole," the kid said. "Cole Garrett?" The world tilted on its axis. The sun-bleached rocks seemed to shimmer and warp. Jed felt the air leave his lungs in a silent gasp. Cole. Alive. It wasn't a ghost. It was a betrayal deeper than hell itself. Cole Garrett, his partner, his friend, the man he'd mourned, the man whose death had added another layer of guilt to his already burdened soul, was alive. And he was Silas Kane. The bank robbery. The locket. It was all a message, a carefully orchestrated piece of theater designed for one audience member, Jedediah Stone. The humming, the mannerisms, they weren't coincidences. They were clues, breadcrumbs left by a ghost to lead him on this very chase. Why, Jed managed to ask, his voice a raw whisper. Why is he doing this? The kid shook his head. "I don't know. He talks about you sometimes, when he drinks. Says you left him. Left him to die in Laredo. Says you owe him a debt. Left him to die." The words were a physical blow. Jed had been pinned down, 3 men firing on him. He'd seen Cole fall across the plaza. By the time he'd fought his way clear, the shootout was over, and Cole was gone, presumed dead. The body they'd found later, face destroyed by a shotgun blast, was wearing Cole's coat, had Cole's papers. A convenient mistake. A perfect escape. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't about money. It was about revenge. A 5-year-old vendetta that had festered in the dark, twisting his friend into the monster called Silas Kane. Jed stood up, turning his back on the terrified outlaw. He walked to his horse, his movements stiff, robotic. "Take your horse," he said over his shoulder, his voice hollow. "Ride north and don't look back." He mounted and rode away, not even waiting to see if the kid obeyed. He didn't care. There was only one thing in the world that mattered now. He was no longer hunting a thief. He was hunting the ghost of his best friend. And the hunt was no longer about a locket or a memory. It was about two men bound by a shared past, riding toward a tragic, unavoidable collision. The weight of betrayal was infinitely heavier than the weight of grief. The revelation that Silas Kane was Cole Garrett changed the texture of the hunt. It was no longer a straight line of pursuit, but a twisted psychological game of chess played across miles of desert and rock. Jed knew Cole was aware he was being followed. He was counting on it. Every clue had been deliberate, every step of the chase a calculated move to draw Jed deeper into his web. Jed pushed on his mind a maelstrom of fractured memories and agonizing questions. He remembered Cole's easy laughter, the way he could charm a confession out of the most hardened criminal. He also remembered the darkness that sometimes flickered in his friend's eyes, a cold, calculating streak that Jed had always dismissed as part of what made him a good marshal. He saw now that he had only ever seen the surface. He knew Cole would anticipate his next move, so he had to think like a ghost himself. He abandoned the main trail, cutting through a treacherous box canyon that most riders would avoid. It was a gamble, but it paid off. He found a hastily abandoned campsite, the embers of a fire still warm. Cole was close, but Cole was one step ahead. As Jed followed the fresh tracks out of the canyon, he saw it a small, isolated homestead nestled in a shallow valley. A plume of smoke rose lazily from its chimney, a picture of peace that Jed's instincts told him was a lie. He dismounted, creeping forward and observing from a ridge. He saw Cole's black stallion tethered near the front porch. The rest of the gang was gone, likely paid off and sent on their way. This was between the two of them now. A woman was hanging laundry on a line, her movements stiff and unnatural. A small boy no older than 7 sat on the porch steps, watching her with wide, frightened eyes. A man stood in the shadows of the doorway. It was Cole. A trap, and it was a masterpiece of cruelty. Cole had chosen a family, a husband, a wife, a child, a perfect agonizing mirror of the life Jed had lost. He was forcing Jed back into the role of protector, dangling innocent lives as bait. It was a direct assault on Jed's deepest wound, his failure to save Eleanor. He was being dared. Can you save this family, Jed, when you couldn't save your own? Rage, cold and pure, surged through Jed, but he forced it down. Rushing in would get them all killed. Cole was waiting for that. He wanted Jed to be reckless, to be driven by emotion. Jed had to be the man he was before the grief hollowed him out. He had to be the marshal, patient, calculating, cold. He spent the rest of the day observing, crawling from one piece of cover to the next, mapping out the homestead. The father, a farmer named Evans, was forced to work in the barn under the watchful eye of Cole, who sat on the porch calmly cleaning his pistol. The wife, Sarah, continued her chores, her face a pale mask of terror. The boy, Tim, didn't move from the steps. Jed's heart ached for them. He saw Eleanor in Sarah's frightened posture, saw the son he'd never had in the boy's silent fear. Cole had known this would cripple him. But it was also Cole's mistake. In trying to exploit Jed's pain, he had reignited the part of him that was most dangerous, his sense of duty. This was no longer about revenge. It was about saving those people. Night fell. A single lamp glowed in the cabin window. Jed slipped away from his hiding place and circled around to the barn. He moved like a shadow, his footsteps silent on the packed earth. The farmer, Evans, had been locked inside. Jed worked the primitive lock on the door, his fingers deft. The door creaked open. Evans scrambled back, his eyes wide with fear in the moonlight. "Who are you?" he whispered. "A friend," Jed replied, his voice a low murmur. "I'm here to help. The man in the house, I need to know his routine." Evans, seeing the quiet authority in Jed's eyes, began to talk. Cole had been there since morning. He was calm, polite, even, which made it all the more terrifying. He ate dinner with them. He was waiting for someone. He kept his gun on the table the whole time. He was sleeping in the main room by the fire. The family was in the single bedroom. He said if we made a sound, he'd... Evans couldn't finish. "He won't," Jed said with a certainty he didn't feel. "I need you to do exactly as I say. When I create a diversion, I need you to get your family out the bedroom window and run for the creek bed. Don't stop for anything. Do you understand?" Evans nodded, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Jed's plan was simple, risky, and relied on Cole's arrogance. He crept to the side of the house, to the small window of the bedroom where the family was being held. He gave a soft whistle, the sound of a night bird. A moment later, he saw Evans' face appear in the window. He gave the signal. Then came the diversion. Jed moved to the far side of the corral where Cole's prized black stallion was tied. He took out his knife and with a single sharp slice cut the reins. He gave the horse a hard slap on the rump. The stallion startled and suddenly free-bolted, galloping wildly across the yard and into the night. Inside the cabin, Jed heard a curse and the scrape of a chair. Cole's voice, sharp and angry, yelled, "Stay where you are." The front door flew open. Cole stood silhouetted against the lamplight, his pistol drawn, staring into the darkness after his horse. That was the moment Jed needed. He raced back to the cabin, staying in the shadows. He could hear the faint sounds of the family scrambling out the back window. Cole, realizing his horse was truly gone, turned to go back inside, his anger making him careless for just a fraction of a second. It was enough. Jed stepped out of the darkness. "Looking for me, Cole?" Cole froze. He spun around, his eyes wide with surprise, and then a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Jed," he breathed, his voice a silky purr of satisfaction. "I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve. Took you long enough. The family is gone." Jed set his own pistol now in his hand, steady and level. "It's just you and me." Cole's smile didn't falter. "That's all it ever was, partner." He took a step back, melting into the deeper shadows of the porch. "But not here. Not like this. This is just the overture. The grand finale, that's yet to come. Meet me at the old mission church in the Cinder Hills. Dawn. We'll finish this the way it should have been finished in Laredo." Before Jed could answer, Cole threw the lamp from inside the cabin out onto the porch. It shattered and oil-fed flames erupted, creating a wall of fire and smoke between them. In the blinding flash, Cole vanished, disappearing into the darkness as expertly as he had appeared in Jed's life. Jed let him go. He knew Cole would keep his word. The final confrontation was set. He turned his attention to the family, finding them huddled in the creek bed, safe. He gave them water and pointed them toward the nearest town. As he watched them disappear into the pre-dawn gloom, he knew he had passed the test Cole had set for him. He had acted not for revenge, but for the sake of others. He had become the marshal again. But the victory felt hollow. He had saved a family, but he was still riding toward a dawn that promised only death and bitter truths. The Cinder Hills were a land of ghosts, skeletal remains of a volcanic age. The ground was black grit, and the wind, which never seemed to stop, carried the sound of 1,000 lonely whispers. At the heart of this desolation stood the ruins of an old Spanish mission, its adobe walls crumbling, its bell tower a jagged tooth against the bruised purple of the pre-dawn sky. A sandstorm was brewing on the horizon, a churning wall of brown that threatened to swallow the world. Jed arrived as the first hint of light touched the eastern sky. He left his horse a mile back and approached on foot, a phantom moving through a dead landscape. He entered the church through a gaping hole where a stained glass window once was. The interior was a cavern of shadows. The roof was gone in places, revealing the angry, swirling sky. Dust motes danced in the faint light like lost souls. Right on time. Jedediah Cole's voice echoed from the shadows of the chancel. Always so predictable. He stepped into view. He looked relaxed, almost serene, holding an antique silver pocket watch in his hand. The ticking was unnaturally loud in the cavernous space. The wind began to howl outside, whipping sand against the crumbling walls. A loose bell in the tower began to toll a deep, mournful dong that sounded like a death knell. "This ends now," Cold Jed said, his voice even betraying none of the turmoil inside him. "Oh, it ended a long time ago," Cole said, snapping the watch shut and pocketing it. "In Laredo. When you chose your career over your partner, when you left me in that street to die. I was pinned down. I thought you were dead," Jed countered, the old excuse tasting like ash in his mouth. Cole laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You thought what was convenient to think? You saw your chance to be the hero, the lone survivor. You never even looked for me. You just accepted the story, identified some poor bastard with his face blown off, and collected your promotion." "That's not how it was," Jed insisted, but a sliver of doubt, old and deep, pricked at him. Had he looked hard enough, or had he been too consumed by his own survival? "Isn't it?" Cole's eyes glittered in the gloom. "It doesn't matter now. I survived. I thrived. And I learned a valuable lesson. Loyalty is a fool's game. But I never forgot the debt you owed me. A life for a life." His face darkened. "And then I heard you'd found happiness. A wife, a home, a perfect little life built on the bones of my supposed death. I couldn't let that stand." The wind shrieked, and the sandstorm hit the church with the force of a physical blow. Dust poured through the openings, instantly reducing visibility to a few feet. The world became a swirling vortex of shadow and grit. "The fire," Jed bit out the words tearing from his throat. "That was you." "An accident," the official report said. Cole mocked his voice, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Just like Laredo was an unfortunate incident. It was so easy. A spilled lantern, a dry barn, a strong wind." He paused, letting the horror of it sink in. "I just wanted to take what you had, Jed. To make you feel what I felt. Alone, burned, left with nothing but ghosts." A raw animal cry of rage and grief tore from Jed's lungs. He raised his pistol, firing into the swirling dust where he thought Cole was standing. The gunshot was swallowed by the storm. A shot answered from his right. A chunk of adobe exploded near Jed's head. He dived behind the remains of a stone altar, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was Cole's world now. Chaos, confusion, and ghosts. "But here's the part you'll really enjoy," Jed Cole's voice taunted closer now. "The part I've saved for this grand finale. You think you were mourning a saint. You think Eleanor was some perfect angel waiting for her hero husband to come home." Jed gritted his teeth. "Don't you speak her name." "I'll do more than speak it," Cole hissed from the darkness. "She wrote to me, Jed, after I contacted her. She was tired. Tired of waiting for you. Tired of being the dutiful marshal's wife, never knowing if you'd come back in a saddle or coffin. She was lonely." The bell above tolled again, a frantic, desperate clang in the raging storm. "She was going to leave you, Jed," the voice whispered right behind him. Jed spun around, firing, but there was nothing there but swirling dust. She was going to come with me. Cole's voice screamed from the other side of the church. We had a plan. She was going to meet me. The locket that wasn't just your gift to her. It was going to be her signal to me. She loved me, Jed. You didn't just lose her in the fire. You had already lost her. The words were bullets, each one finding its mark, shredding the very fabric of Jed's reality. The pure, righteous grief he had carried for 5 years was a lie. The woman he had mourned, the perfect memory he had enshrined, was a fiction. He wasn't a failed protector. He was a deluded fool. A shape materialized in the dust in front of him. It was Cole, his face, a demonic mask of triumphant hatred. Now you know the truth, he snarled. The fight was no longer about guns. It was primal. Jed lunged, tackling Cole, and they crashed to the floor, rolling in the dust and debris. It was a battle of bitter truths and broken brotherhood. Fists flew, connecting with brutal force. They were two sides of the same coin, a lawman and an outlaw, a hero and a ghost, locked in a final desperate embrace. Jed fought through a red haze of pain and betrayal. He felt a sharp, searing pain in his side as Cole's knife found its mark. He grunted, slamming Cole's head against the stone floor. Cole's grip loosened. Jed scrambled back, clutching his bleeding side, his pistol lost in the struggle. Cole rose to his knees, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. He raised his own pistol, the barrel looking like a black tunnel in the dim light. "Goodbye, partner," he rasped. At that moment, the storm seemed to hold its breath. A section of the weakened roof, battered by the wind, gave way. A massive wooden beam, black with age, crashed down between them with a deafening, splintering roar. It struck Cole, pinning his legs beneath its immense weight. His gun flew from his hand. Jed stared, breathing heavily, as the dust began to settle. Cole lay trapped, his face contorted in agony and shock. The storm outside began to recede, its fury spent. The bell fell silent. Faint, gray light filtered into the ruined church. It was over. Jed staggered to his feet, pressing a hand against the gash in his side. Blood, warm and slick, seeped through his fingers. He looked at Cole, trapped and helpless beneath the fallen beam, his legs crushed at unnatural angles. The hatred on Cole's face had been replaced by a raw, naked pain. The monster was gone. All that was left was the broken man Jed once called a friend. The old Jed, the man who rode into these hills fueled by a 5-year-old rage, would have walked over, picked up Cole's gun, and ended it. Vengeance was a simple, clean answer. But the man standing there was different. He had been hollowed out and refilled not with rage, but with a devastating, complicated truth. Killing Cole now would be an execution, not justice. It would be a surrender to the very darkness that had consumed his friend. He walked over his boots, crunching on the debris, and kicked Cole's pistol away. He then holstered his own. He looked down at the man who had destroyed his life, not with hatred, but with a profound, aching weariness. He had faced his ghosts and learned that they were far more human and tragic than he had ever imagined. Choosing justice over vengeance wasn't a grand moral victory. It was simply the only thing left to do. It was the final defining act of the marshal he once was and the man he had to become. He fashioned a travois, and in a grueling, agonizing effort, managed to load the semi-conscious Cole onto it. The journey back to civilization was a slow, torturous pilgrimage through the Cinder Hills. Every step was a battle against his own pain and exhaustion. He didn't ride to redemption. He took Cole to the county seat in Prescott, handing him over directly to the U.S. Marshals Service. He delivered his prisoner along with a quiet, concise report that detailed the robbery and the hostage situation, but omitted the deeper personal history between them. That part was his burden to carry alone. He spent a few days in Prescott, long enough for a doctor to stitch his side and for him to give a final deposition. He spoke with the presiding marshal, a man named Fisk, who looked at Jed with a mixture of respect and curiosity. "You brought in Silas Kane alone," Fisk said, shaking his head in disbelief. "There's a substantial reward. The bank in Redemption is offering $5,000. Jed just nodded, his face impassive. "You know," Fisk continued, leaning back in his chair, "with a record like yours, and now this, you could have your badge back for the asking. We need men like you." Jed looked out the window at the bustling street. For a moment he considered it. The structure, the purpose, the clear lines between right and wrong. But he knew those lines were never as clear as they seemed. "My time as a marshal is over," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm a rancher now." He collected the reward money, every dollar, feeling like it was stained with blood and lies. He watched as the rest of Cole's gang rounded up based on his information was brought in. All the loose ends were being tied up, the chaos brought back into order. But inside him, the tangles remained. He had the answers he'd sought, but they offered no peace, only the quiet devastation of truth. Jed rode back into Redemption, a different man than the one who had fled it. The town looked the same, dusty, tired, and clinging to life under the relentless sun. But he saw it with new eyes. He was no longer a ghost haunting its edges. He was a part of its story. His first stop was not his ranch, but the small office of Sheriff Miller. He walked in and placed a heavy canvas bag on the desk. Miller looked from the bag to Jed's stitched side, and the new lines of exhaustion etched on his face. "That's the reward money," Jed said. $5,000. I want you to use it to repair the bank. And give 1,000 of it to the Evans family, the ones Kane held hostage. Tell them it's from the town, to help them get back on their feet." Miller was speechless. "Mr. Stone, Jed, that's your money. You earned it." "I have what I need," Jed replied. The money was a part of a story he needed to close. Rebuilding something Kane had broken felt like the only clean thing he could do with it. It was a small act of construction in the face of so much destruction. It was an investment not in a building, but in a future he now felt unexpectedly tied to. He left the sheriff's office and walked through the town. He nodded at the people he passed, and they nodded back, their expressions a mix of awe and gratitude. The story of his hunt for Silas Kane had already become legend. He wasn't a recluse anymore. He was the man who had faced down the devil and returned. He had left his isolation behind in the ruins of that mission church. He had confronted his past, and in doing so had found a tentative path back to the world of the living. The last stop on his journey was a small windswept cemetery on a hill overlooking the town. There was a single, simple headstone of plain gray granite. Eleanor Stone, beloved wife. The words felt both true and false at the same time. The sun was setting, casting long, mournful shadows across the graves. He stood before her resting place for a long time, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind through the dry grass. He reached into his waistcoat, his fingers closing around the cool, smooth metal of the silver locket. He had recovered it from Cole's possessions in Prescott. He pulled it out, letting it rest in his calloused palm. The engraved roses were worn, the silver tarnished from its journey. This object had been the catalyst for everything. It had represented a perfect stolen love. Now it represented something far more complex, a love that was real, but flawed, a history of secrets and betrayals, a tragedy born from human weakness. For a moment, he thought he would leave it here. Place it on the headstone as a final farewell, a closing of the book on the life and the lies that had defined him for so long. It would be the clean, simple ending. Instead, he slowly, deliberately opened the tiny clasp. Inside there were no portraits. There were 2 small empty frames waiting for pictures that were never placed. It was a vessel of possibility of a future that never was, for reasons he now understood were far more complicated than a simple tragic fire. He looked at the empty frames, and for the first time he did not feel the searing rage of betrayal or the hollow ache of grief. He felt a quiet, profound sadness for all of them, for himself, for the woman he had loved, and even for the friend he had lost. He closed the locket with a soft click. He did not place it on the grave. He did not throw it away. He quietly slipped it into his own pocket. It was a part of his story now. Not an icon of a perfect past to be worshipped, nor a reminder of a bitter lie to be despised, but a complex, heavy piece of his own history. He would carry it not as a burden that would crush him, but as a reminder that the past is never simple, and that peace is not found in forgetting, but in accepting the whole, terrible, beautiful truth. He stood a moment longer, then turned his back on the grave. He did not look toward the lonely silhouette of his ranch on the horizon. His gaze and his steps were pointed in the other direction. He walked toward the faint lights of redemption, toward the town, toward the community, toward a new and uncertain life he was finally ready to begin.